Vivek Ramaswamy, welcome to Dad Saves America.
It's great to be on, John. Thank you for having me.
One of the things that was striking to me watching your run for president is that you put yourself in more situations where you were engaged in real discourse with people that actually disagree than I think maybe anybody I've seen. So why is that important? Why is it important to engage with people who disagree with you?
It's important to my own identity and upbringing. Part of my own upbringing was I was always in settings where I was a little bit different, a little bit the odd man out in one direction or another. I went to a relatively modest public school in terms of its quality and children who came from a lot of more challenged backgrounds than I did. I then went to a private Jesuit high school where I was the lone Hindu student in a Catholic high school. And one of the things that I learned was you actually get a better education when you surround yourself with people who don't agree with you. When I went to Harvard, when I went to Yale, I would say I got more of my money's worth, largely because my ideology on politics or other issues wasn't necessarily the same. It definitely wasn't the same as the majority of other students. But I think you get to truth when you are tested through actual free speech, actual open debate. I've tried to build my companies the same way. You hear a lot of concern today in today's corporate settings about diversity of various kinds, but I think one of the kinds of diversity that's missing most in most corporate boardrooms today is an actual diversity of thought in ways that challenge each company or organization to be the best version of itself. And so that was my background all the way from youth to higher education to the business world. It was always something that served me well. Selfishly, it made me the best version of myself to surround myself with people who I disagreed with. And in politics, I realized that certainly if you're running in a primary, that's not going to naturally happen. You're going to have a lot of cheap attacks from people who actually mostly agree with you. That's the way a primary works. But there wasn't a lot of actual ideological discourse between people who fundamentally disagreed with each other. And so I tried to use the same formula that allowed me to achieve success in other domains to bring that to politics and say, let's actually respect each other, have an open debate. We may not agree on everything, but we're committed to your right to speak as long as I get to in return. And it's, for me, just a core part of who I am. And I think a core part of the country that I pledge allegiance to, which is the United States of America.
In traveling the country, how would you assess sort of the state of discourse? I know it's easy to look at media and say our discourse is polarized and is broken. Is there anything you saw as you traveled the country that adds texture to that sense of how effectively we're having conversations across different ideological lines, across different issues?
Yeah, so I'll give you both the positive and the negative that I see from traveling across the country. The positive is people, especially in some ways young people, but I think all of us, are hungry for open dialogue. People are not having open conversations anymore, and they're so hungry for spaces where they can express themselves even when they're not necessarily 100% sure, is this what I believe? But here's what I think I believe. I want to say it. But the flip side is what that leads to is a culture of fear, where too many people anymore are afraid to actually do that because they feel like it's going to have negative consequences on their life. And so we're at this tipping point where, on one hand, there's this culture of fear that I do think has silenced true open debate in the country. But on the other hand, such a demand for it. It's like a dam on the other side that if that dam breaks, I think we're actually at a place in our country's history where you're going to see a lot of ideological and open debate and discussion that we haven't seen in a long time that I think could enrich our culture, but you got to overcome that culture of fear that we're up against to actually get there. So that was the good and the bad that I saw. And my state of where we are, my assessment of the state of where we are right now is in this liminal state in between this suppressed, silencing culture of fear and potentially a renaissance of actual open debate that I think our country was built on in the first place.
One of the things I find interesting, in your book, Nation of Victims, you talk about a kind of cultural legacy that starts with Americans as underdogs and seems to, I think you trace a kind of evolution into a kind of natural willingness to embrace victimhood, to embrace being the oppressed, being the underdog. In your time now, since writing the book and thinking about this and confronting this sort of identity politics culture, how do you think about that? Why is identity politics and this sort of oppression Olympics so viral?
Yeah, look, I think that one is it's convenient. I mean, human beings respond to incentives. And so if you have a culture that rewards victimhood narratives, it reinforces more of those victimhood narratives. So part of that is just the incentive structure we've created. But I think it's against the backdrop of something deeper going on in the country where people have lost their sense of identity, right? I think all of us are hungry for purpose and meaning. It's what makes us different from animals. Animals don't hunger to a higher purpose. They hunger to whatever fills their urge to fulfill their meal or to reproduce. We human beings are different in that we can believe in something greater than ourselves. And so that's part of how we're wired. Yet when we lose the things that used to ground us, faith in God, patriotism, belief in country, national pride, even belief in grounding in a family, belief in self, that you're an agent in the world and that you have your own free will. When you stop believing in the things that have grounded us in the past and grounded our sense of identity, I think you latch on to new forms of identity instead. And so that's where I think we've seen the rise of group identity. And once you latch on your identity to a group, you're pitting one group versus another. The natural impulse is for one group to see itself as a victim at the hands of the other, because victimhood allows you to make a claim on somebody else for something you don't already have. So I think the deeper root cause is this deeper loss of purpose and meaning that we as human beings are wired to need to have filled in some way. If you don't believe in God, you're going to believe in something. If you don't believe in your country or pledge allegiance to the American flag, you're going to pledge allegiance to a different flag. It just might be a flag grounded in victimhood of group identity instead. And I think that's what we've seen happen in the country.
So, you've laid out, again, in some of your other writing and speaking about how this identity politics and victimhood culture has sort of made its way into the corporate world. And the thing that's so striking is what's happened to high school debate, high school and college, is the complete collapse of what you're talking about. It's the complete collapse of allowing both sides of the argument to be made strongly, and often for you to have to make the strong version of the argument for somebody, for the other side, for the side you don't personally agree with. How do you understand what's happening there? Like what is the problem going on? Why is debate being essentially destroyed in school?
Yeah, so look, I think that there's a couple things going on here. Part of this is a symptom of a different trend we're seeing in our schools and our educational system, which is a broader assault on excellence, actually. It's no longer cool to be the smartest kid in the class or the person who's doing the best in an academic subject at school. And part of doing well in school is being curious, engaging, right? Being the person in class who's engaged with your peers and with the teacher and what they're teaching you. And so I think part of that is culturally we've seen this artificiality of dullness, right? That it's cool to be dull. And part of being dull is you're not an overachiever, but part of being dull is that if you're too willing to engage in debate or whatever, that's not the cool thing to do. I think that's a trend we've seen. So that's part of what we're seeing. I think part of what we're seeing in parallel, and I think that these are two different trends, but they converge. There's a separate trend where there is a top-down ideology that the school systems have been really deputized to advance. And a lot of that comes from the U.S. Department of Education, comes from school boards that say that, you know what, we're not just interested in teaching kids how to think, which is what high-quality debate is about, but we're much more interested in teaching kids what to think, right? The planet's going to burn itself to pieces unless the next generation takes action to stave off global climate change. We're going to suffer systemic inequity unless you open your eyes to the invisible injustices, opening your eyes to the intersectional ladder based on race and gender and sexuality. And a lot of these are substantive views that themselves, the substantive view is hostile to debate, right? I think Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley summed it up. And I say this not to make a political point, but just to understand the view that's on the table here. I think she said, we don't want, this is an exact quote, her words, not mine, we don't want any more black faces that don't want to be a black voice. We don't want any more brown faces that don't want to be a brown voice. I'm pretty sure that's an exact quote. Well, think about that. What does it mean to have a black voice or a brown voice? It means if you have a certain skin color, that means you're confined in the set of opinions that you're allowed to have. That is fundamentally hostile to debate. The idea of saying something that somebody disagrees with that may offend their personhood, something that you might call a microaggression, is fundamentally hostile to debate. And so I think that what you're seeing is the rise of substantive ideologies that are being pushed through our schools, that the content of the ideology is itself hostile to the procedure of debate. And so those two things are happening at the same time, is this anti-excellence culture that tells you to shut up, sit down, do as you're told, pretend like you're dumb, because that's the cool thing to act like you're in school anymore. Be a dull person and to have the ennui of passiveness, right? That's kind of part of the ethos of what it means to be a cool kid, combined with a top-down ideology that says there are certain things that are outside of the Overton window of what you're allowed to say, or else you run against being a bad person. I think those two forces have converged to be fundamentally hostile to debate so far. And I think everything that I told you is true, at least as of about a year or 2 or 3 years ago. As you see over the course of time, these pendulums swing back and forth. And so that has created what we began as a counterculture. A lot of that began as counterculture, has now become the new system. I think what you're seeing across the country is now young people saying, okay, that is the new system. How do I rebel against that? And I think that's the earliest stages of what we're beginning to see brew now across the country, is the counter-rebellion to the counter-rebellion.
The extent to which our school system is structured as a kind of top-down experience. What do you think of that fact? What do you think of the way school is delivered as part of the problem? Because it does feel like school doesn't actually teach you to be prepared for the kind of world we're heading into now.
Yeah, look, I think that, first of all, we got to recognize that every kid is different. And one of the problems with a top-down formulation of education, period, is that it denies that actual diversity. I'm not talking about shades of melanin or shades of tans, but I'm talking about actual diversity, even in a household. Anybody who's a parent who's had more than one kid in the house, who aren't twins, sometimes even who are twins, but certainly anybody who's had more than one kid will tell you it's the same gene pool, it's the same upbringing, the same house, the same roof they live under, and yet every kid is different, right? Some kids are better at learning in certain settings, one-on-one settings. Other kids are better at learning in group settings. Some kids are more social, others are nonverbal, but learn in other ways. And I think that when you have a top-down educational system, to say there's a school district because you happen to live in one particular geographic zip code, that you're going to have one standard formulation of an assembly line that you send those kids through as though they're, ingredients in a food production factory. I think you get a lot of kids, a small minority of kids for whom that's a perfect fit, but a larger majority of kids for whom that wasn't necessarily the perfect fit. And so what I do think we're missing, and we're going to get there, but what we're missing is a diversity of educational modalities, from charter schools to smaller public schools to larger public schools to homeschooling, which I think is underappreciated in the value that it can deliver to kids early on, that match the true diversity of the way kids actually learn. That's part of why I think the homogeneity of a top-down model is broken to start with. Now, we're going to take that one step further. Part of what you have with the top-down model is that it lends itself to capture, right? Part of what's happening is the U.S. Department of Education, a federal agency, is using the dollars that it distributes to local schools as a cudgel, as a sort of noose, to say that unless you adopt certain ideologies in your curriculum, we're not going to give you those federal dollars. Modern DEI standards, modern racial equity narratives, and so on. And yet, at the same time, you're also seeing many of those schools that might teach archery. This is a real example, saying that they won't get funding from the U.S. Department of Education because that's outside the acceptable bounds of what the federal government deems to be appropriate education for kids. And so I think that it lends itself, not only is it just a single monolith that betrays the actual diversity of needs that kids have, but it's also a vector for ideological capture, which is something that we've seen happen in the last 10 years as well.
To what extent do you feel like DEI actually undermines the very objectives that it claims to care about?
Well, I talked about this extensively in my first book, Woke Inc., which I see you have right in front of you, which is that in the name of diversity, we've actually sacrificed true diversity of thought. Right? In the name of inclusion, we've actually created a culture where certain points of view just aren't welcome. And it's interesting, right, that the best way to screen for diversity of thought, you would think, is to screen candidates in a particular forum or a particular company for the diversity of their thoughts. The best way to screen for diversity of experience might be to ask different candidates or participants about the diversity of their experiences. And yet we've fallen into a trap where we've used genetically inherited characteristics as a proxy for diversity of thought and experience, when in fact the objective was to, in many ways, avoid that diversity of thought or experience in the first place. So it's not just an accident or a failure. It's a question of intentional design. And I think every human being has probably been in a room where you've had a lot of people in a room who look the same, but who think differently. And I think we've all probably been in rooms where you have a lot of people who look different, who still all think the same. And so part of the I would say, coup of the DEI agenda is that they've failed to define what DEI actually means. And the absence of a clear definition isn't a bug, it's a feature because it allows them to continue to shift the definition to evade a particular criticism. But I think part of what this agenda is about is using the appearance of diversity to actually sacrifice true diversity of thought at the altar. And that's why it's fundamentally hostile to debate itself. I think chances are if you're screening for actual diversity of thought in a boardroom or a debate competition for that matter, you're going to probably have diverse shades of melanin. You're probably going to have a bunch of different heights of people, or a bunch of people who come from different economic backgrounds, or people who come from different racial backgrounds, men and women alike, boys and girls alike, maybe even people of sexual orientations that differ from the standard cis heterosexual. Doesn't matter. That's an accident or a byproduct of actually selecting for true diversity of thought. And I think much of the modern DEI agenda has it completely backwards.
You talk a lot in your campaigning and as a public voice about national unity. And I think now more than ever, that seems harder to grasp, harder to discover what will unify us. Is there a unity in engaging in real debate? Like, what's the relationship between being able to have debate and actually finding unity? Because those two things, in some sense, seem like they're kind of at odds with each other.
Well, look, I think they're deeply linked. I think that if you're able to tell someone what you actually think, that means you respect them. I think when I say stand up and say what you believe, say it with the spine and say it with conviction, but say it with respect. And part of debate is engaging in the practice of respect for the person who's across the table from you. And part of respect is that you respect them enough to tell them what you actually believe without delivering some sanitized version of it that you think they want to hear. Thomas Sowell actually said this well. He said it beautifully. If you care about somebody, you tell them the truth. If you care about yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. Well, if you're delivering to somebody the truth, or at least what your true belief is, that means you actually respect them. I think it fosters greater respect for the other when you say, you know what, even though you don't disagree with me, I'm going to tell you what I believe. I'm going to tell you what I believe, not because it's going to make you like me more in the instance, but because I think you have the dignity as a human being that I'm going to respect as a co-equal enough that I will respect you enough to tell you what my actual convictions are. And I'm going to give you the same chance to do the same to me in return. That's true respect. Not a condescending perspective which says, well, you may not be able to handle what I actually believe, so I'm going to tell you what lands on your ears more comfortably. Comfort food for the ear. No, that's not. It's the opposite of debate. But what it is condescension. So I think at the heart of a true debate between peers is a fundamental respect for the other, a fundamental equality and a unity in that conviction. That's part of what's going to unite this country. I think the irony is the more enriched, open, earnest, high-quality debate we have between people of different opinion, the more likely we are to be united as a country in the first place. That's what we're missing today. So it's no accident that we've seen the decline in a commitment to open debate over the same period that we have also seen a national division that I don't think is a coincidence. I think these things go hand in hand together.
We are in a very strange moment where, as a nation, the biggest debate stage, which you participated in, the presidential debate stages, we're now heading into the final stretch between two presumptive nominee candidates. How should I understand where debate is in this country as it plays out at the highest possible level? Like, what's going on here? I know people can rightfully look at the presidential debates and say, well, it's all kabuki theater. What do I get out of this? But why is it important that the candidates continue to actually have debates, even when it's two candidates we've already seen? We've already seen them go through a round. What new are we going to get out of this? Why does this matter?
Well, look, I think that seeing somebody engage with someone who they disagree with gives you a window into who they really are as a person. And I also think that especially in the modern environment where so much of what people learn about political leaders is filtered through intermediating channels, the chance to be able to see it directly coming from one candidate versus another is a path to truth that we're actually missing in modern American politics. So I think it's vital. We've always had presidential debates for a reason. I think we need to continue to have them. It's part of who we are. We need to bring back that spirit of the Lincoln Douglas debates. We need to bring back the spirit of people who are able to travel this country, go to different places together, and to be able to say, even though we disagree like hell on certain policies, we're still committed to the best interests of this country, the United States of America. And once we lose that, I don't think we have the same country left. I truly believe that.
What's the hardest thing about the formality of that debate structure? And I know there's lots of different rules that you can be part of. And in the high school level, there's all these different formats. At the big national stage, you've got these different formats. What's the hardest part? You know, you've been through it.
Yeah.
What was the most challenging?
I think the hardest part in the political context, as opposed to, in a high school debate context, the hardest part in a political context is there's a certain artificiality to the way the exercise is actually constructed, right? If it's one-on-one, that's, I think, a pretty good setting, actually. But when you got 10 Republican candidates on stage, it ends up being literally a theatrical production disguised as a debate. You have 30 seconds to make a point. You're designed to do it to be able to capture, realizing that most people aren't simultaneously watching it. How do you generate the shortest moment in which the other 9 million people who you want to see it, or the other 100 million people who want to see it, actually end up seeing it? It ends up becoming more of a theatrical exercise disguised as a debate. So I have no problem with theatrical exercises, just call it a theatrical exercise. But I think the sleight of hand in calling that a debate, when in fact it's a social media production or a multimedia production, I think creates a kind of dishonesty. And I think that's one of the things that makes certain forms of those presidential debates worse than others. I think a one-on-one debate between two general election candidates is a different story. 2 hours, isolated format, and really going directly at the two candidates who have fundamentally different ideologies from one another, I think is actually far more productive.
What else would you want to share, especially with parents, about how to help our kids use debate as a tool to set them up for success in life? Why is it important for me as a parent, or for the viewer as a parent, to look at this issue and say, this really matters, and I need to make sure that my son or daughter is capable of engaging in discourse?
Yeah, look, I think that it starts at home, starts at the dinner table. For me, one of the experiences early on in my childhood came from my own parents. My father ended up going to law school when I was in middle school. He did it as night school, though. He worked at the GE plant in Evendale, Ohio, under Jack Welch's tenure, where he faced layoffs. They laid off about 2/3 of the people at the plant, but his way of being able to keep job security was they were short on patent attorneys, and he was an engineer. So if he went to night school all the way in northern Kentucky, 45 minutes from where we lived, and did that for 4 years, he would have a secure job. Well, my parents didn't have childcare or child support or anything like that, so often my dad would take me with him to those law classes at night. I was in 6th grade. I would sit in the back of the class. But I remember the way my dad would use those long drives back home, those 45-minute drives back home, would be to sort of engage me in debate, right? He would lean maybe a little left of center, and so he would criticize what Clarence Thomas, Renton, and Scalia had to say. And as a 11-year-old, 12-year-old myself, I was able to take the other side of that debate. And it was a great way that, even to the point you raised earlier about unity, that brought me closer to my dad. That's actually something, debating at the dinner table and in those long car rides actually brought us together in a way that we probably wouldn't have happened if we weren't engaging in that type of debate. And I think that's the friendliest setting in which to begin, because it teaches kids who know they have the love of their parents, but are able to then learn to say that even if you disagree with them, dealing with one another as peers and as adults in the context of a debate, that allows you to see that how much you love or regard a person is separate from whether or not you disagree with them. And that's where the role of the family here in reviving debate is maybe even more vital, is definitely even more vital than that of our schools. And so I think parents who take that opportunity with their kids, at least for me in my upbringing and the way we think about raising our boys now, is it's a great chance to treat your kids not just in the disciplining sense or the pedagogical sense as a parent, but the beginnings of also showing them that you see them as a real person with their own views by engaging them in that debate. And I think it's a great way to not only bring a family together, but to teach kids that against the backdrop of loving somebody if you can disagree, then you can go into the world and have a relationship with your fellow citizens who you may not agree with too, but who you can still respect and, dare I say, have a special type of love and relationship for your fellow citizen as well, that I think we're missing today.
Yeah, that resonates so deeply with me. I I have my son's graduating high school this week, and debate has been such a big part of our relationship. And it is funny that trust and a sense that there is a shared objective that's bigger than the debate that's being had seems to be so important for the potential to learn in that debate process. Is there anything else you'd want to share about this topic and this concern?
I'm optimistic that this is going to sort itself out, right? That the assault on this culture of debate that I think was at our country's founding, we're going through a little bit of a adolescent period where we're rebelling against that with this censorious culture. But there's something native about us as human beings that resists that, right? One of the things that makes us human beings is the idea that we're able to have these beliefs. And it's foundational to who we are as human beings, as free agents with free will, to want to express those thoughts and views with others. And I think that's been true for all of human history, and it's true today. And so as dangerous as it might feel at times to live in a culture that suppresses that, I don't think that's going to naturally last for long, because we as human beings have been wired. It's in our very nature to want to express ourselves. And I think that is part of what's going to bring us together as a country again.
And do you think that's baked into the American DNA? Is there something uniquely American about discourse? Is it our diversity? Is it the nature?
America was a country built on the idea of the marketplace of ideas. America as an idea was built on the idea that every idea deserves to be expressed. Every opinion gets to be expressed. They put the First Amendment first for a reason. You're free to practice your faith, and you're free to express your opinion, no matter how heinous your peers might think that opinion is. So yes, they put the First Amendment first for a reason. It was core to the founding of our country. It's core to the DNA of our country. And the beauty of America is it was founded on the attributes that make us human ourselves. Our free will, endowed in us by our Creator, was written into the very Declaration of Independence that formed the DNA of America's own founding. And so this idea of debate bringing us together, that's a distinctively American idea. I won't call it uniquely American, because we've exported that idea to other countries around the world, but it is distinctively American. And when we think about what makes America great again, we got to maybe remember what made America great the first time around, and the openness and the love of open dialogue and debate and free speech. Yeah, that's absolutely what made America great the first time around. And that's what's going to make America great again if we have a shot at reviving this country.
Being a dad is perhaps the most heroic role we can embrace. And it's in that family environment that then expands out to the community and the country where we make the biggest difference. So how do you see your role in the American story and as a father?
My role as a father is the most important hat that I wear. But part of what I'm doing in public life is because I'm a father, actually. I would have never gone into politics had I not brought our two sons into this world along with my wife, Apurva, and raising those two boys. That's what opened my eyes to care enough to say, you know what, we had the country that allowed Apurva and I to live the American dream, to be able to achieve what we wanted to through hard work and dedication, but still expressing our mind at every step of the way freely without fear. It's my concern that that country doesn't exist for our kids right now. That's what moves me to do what I'm doing right now. And so in many ways, I don't think about fatherhood as separate from public service. They go together. And I think that I probably speak for a lot of people who have lived the American dream when I say this, the real inheritance we want to give our kids isn't just a bunch of green pieces of paper. It is a country that allows them to live that same American dream that Apurva and I both did. And so, yes, I think my role as a father is the most important one, but it's also the one that gives me inspiration to do the kinds of things I do outside of the household as well. And, you know, every one of us has to find our purpose and motivation. And for me, that's a big part of mine.
Vivek, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, man.